Hello, hello, hello. Good morning. Welcome to this lecture, Art and Activism, Earworming Dissent and Seeding Climate Justice. My name is Chihiro Geuzenbroek, and I'll be sharing a little bit about my practice as a interdisciplinary creative activist, artist, and different creative muscles that I use. And hopefully it will inspire you in your own practice, in your own journey this week and much more time to come. So yeah, without further ado, let's just get started. I hope you have maybe a pen and paper close by to doodle or to just note little sparks that come up in your own brain or heart, things that resonate or things that just give you a creative impulse. So let's get started. I will situate myself first. So my background is in film. I studied media and culture. For those who wish to know a little bit more about me, you can check out my website, chihiro.nl, where you will find that I am active across the spectrum of activities, from spoken word poetry to making after videos of creative actions, writing songs, an exhibit. And today we will go through some of these expressions and reflect on them, how art and activism can meet. But before we dive into the expressions and examples, I would like to stand still for a moment with the notion of art and activism, because I realize most people have heard about activism all of their lives through TV or mainstream culture, where activism just gets equated with saying no, being angry and saying no. Or as an artist, maybe you have embraced the activist position to be edgy, but not necessarily advance collective well-being or rectification of human rights harms or environmental harms. So I want to stand still for a moment with positionality and arts and activism before we dive in. So this would be way more fun if we were all in one room and we could all get up and position ourselves through space. So imagine yourself in a big room where on the left side of the wall would represent the far end of the spectrum. If your life is about the communal well-being, that can be the communal well-being of a particular community you're part of or an oppressed identity, or it can be the communal well-being of like all Earth ecosystems, but it's the collective. And imagine on the right side of the room, more of a mindset of me, myself, and I. So really looking out for the personal identity or the individual, so to speak, which we have been groomed into more in this society to be more individualistic. So probably you're not either one, probably you're a bit of both, but think about this as a spectrum and think about where your practice, your artistic practice might be. And as an artist, you probably get more persuaded towards the individual voice because you're invited to speak as an auteur, as a maker, as something set apart from the rest. So there's no shame in either side, but just to know that the activist tendency is not just for yourself, but for a bigger collective. On the other side, I want you to imagine the front end and the back end of the room, and think about the back end of the room being 100% conformist. So you as a person tend to conform or be passive in society, just to swallow or to take, and sometimes that is not really a thing you choose, but it's just a way of life that you've been more accustomed to. Or are you more of an activator, an innovator, somebody makes interventions, comes up with the new stuff? And here, the artistic practice tends to push you more towards the intervention, activation, inspiration, and outside of the boxness. So if you see that and you position yourself somewhere in this multidimensional space, you can reflect on your own positionality, and you can see that in general, art, activism tends to be on the corner of communal welfare and activation. And you see that art tends to be more individualistic, but also more towards the activation. So there's a push and pull, and this is my vision, of course, but I hope it's a helpful way to kind of situate ourselves in this conversation, that there's probably a little bit of art and activism already in you, and probably also some things that you might want to explore, or things that you are not even aware of, as we all are on this journey together. So I am speaking from this yellow blob. This tends to be more leaning towards the communal welfare and more towards the activation. But you see there's a space that can be way more radical out in the corner. So this is my positionality as we talk about examples today. So the examples of art and activism today that I'll be sharing with you are concerning performance, poetry, hoaxing, culture jamming, music, and exhibition. And these are kind of categories that I came up with that I could make this talk orderly, but of course some things overlap. Like this photograph, for example, is a photograph that I took during an action from Extinction Rebellion. It was a fashion action critiquing the textile industry, the human rights harms, the environmental harms. And they worked with models that were both different size, different abilities, different identities, and also different ways of relating to textiles. So for example, in this particular model, and this is Freeman Hopeless, Ariel Freeman Hopeless Freeman, sorry, I messed that up. Ariel Hopeless Freeman Hopeless. I'm hopeless. Ariel. So Ariel is an amazing model in her professional life, and she volunteered here to walk the design of a designer that made this with recycled banners from the Shell Must Fall campaign. And she's walking here in the most expensive shopping street of Amsterdam. So the street, the context where the fashion industry is normalized and expensive design as a virtue, she is kind of hacking that space with her body and this dress and her message of shall we stop? And here I took this photograph. This was obviously an action from an activist group. It's also a creative expression, and then later this photograph and the dress was part of an exhibit. So yeah, there's all the layers and that often happens with art and activism, because they tend to be performed or put in a space, and depending on where the space is next, they can have different articulations. So I wanted to start with performance, because performance leads me to this story of fossil-free culture. It's, I think, an amazing collective of artists in the Netherlands that really showcase how art and activism can be super effective. So I'm going to read something of their website to just explain a little bit of their work. I refer to the collective as they, but I should say I'm also part of the performances, but behind the camera. So here you see me in the picture. The person on the stairs behind all the performers in the white dresses is me, and I'm walking through the performance as I'm filming for the after video, but I'm not in a core team, so I refer to the collective as a they, and I will read to you what they do. We merge aesthetics and poetry with the audacity and commitment of activism to create boundary-pushing interventions inside the museums that accept fossil fuel sponsorship. In this case, this was an action that was called Drop the Shell. You see here 7 muses in white dresses, and they all carried a shell. This is in the hall of one of the most famous museums of the Netherlands, the Van Gogh Museum. And they start drinking from the shell a kind of oily substance and drip it over themselves. And in the end of the performance, they drop the shell, whilst one of the performers is reading or citing from a letter of Van Gogh to his brother, in which he comments, "The tides are rising high." He is talking to his brother about selling his life dearly, and also asking, what would life be if we had no courage to attempt anything? And so by using the lines of Van Gogh himself, really context specific, and at the same time we're making this poetic intervention of the fact that oil is dirtying the museum and there should be courage to defend life itself. All performers were actually arrested on the spot by the museum after a bit of confusion, because first they thought maybe, you know, is this part of the museum? They do performances in the museum. But then they were arrested. They were kept, some of them, for 3 days. And so a lot of media picked up on it in newspapers. There were some solidarity actions outside of the museum in the days following. And of course, it generated a lot of negative attention. And where Shell might not care about negative attention as much because it's used to it and it has all its lawyers, the museum doesn't like to be in that space. And so it's also a strategic way of intervening in the social license of the fossil fuel industry here in the Netherlands, and whether they should belong in institutions that are held as one, respectable art spaces of inspiration, and 2, museums are often thought of as the most trusted knowledge institutions, more than the news on TV or the newspaper. And so to associate for Shell their brand with the museum gives them a lot, but it doesn't give society a lot, because they actually undermine the health of society with their climate disruption and human rights violation. So that was a long introduction, but I wanted to start here because fossil fuel culture has been so effective. So in the Van Gogh Museum, there were 6, I believe, interventions beyond insanity: drop the shell, spoiled landscapes, shells everywhere, loud, clear, and huge, and Shell's dirty hands, before the museum finally got to a point where they dropped Shell. And we celebrated that on the museum plain, there was this huge institution, and just with a handful of people, we managed to break up that relationship. And of course, they will never credit the activist or the artist for it. Yeah, the results are in. Let's just say that. So here we see some of the other performances. With each performance, there would be a little folder that was in the style of the Van Gogh Museum. And like here on the verge of insanity, this was an actual exhibit, where the exhibit would go about the diagnose or the different perspectives on Van Gogh's mental state. We played with the insanity of having oil in an art institution, and like fake art with oil spills and everything in the brochure. So we would put those brochures through the museum, and lots of people would pick them up, and also would give context to the performance. And all of this, of course, also requires artists on board, designers, and storytelling and imagination of tweaking. So yeah, very successful. All of these performances have videos that are on YouTube. You can watch them to get inspiration. After winning the Van Gogh Museum's breakup with Shell, Fossil Free Culture went after the next institute that's also on the museum plan in Amsterdam, which is the Concert Hall, that also had a sponsorship relationship with Shell. And after a few interventions there, they also broke up their relationship. That's just the long story short. One of them was throwing unplayable music off the balcony as and so the level of disruption also kind of increases over time, or you get creative to make sure that either through frequency of performances, like tightening it, like after a while they know you're going to come back and then you're just coming back like 3 times in a month, or by doing actions that are even more disruptive. So this was last year in 2020 during COVID. You can see the masks. We celebrated that actually through effective art resistance. There was a fossil-free museum playing, and it was a beautiful occasion. So I love to share this for performances, to see that art and activism can really have an impact. And this is just in recent years. Fossil-free culture started in 2016. So just between 2016 and 2020, there are a number of institutions that were effectively persuaded to break their sponsorship relationship with Shell. So up next, I'm going to talk a little bit about poetry and my relationship with poetry. For me, poetry gives me the most freedom to weave through emotional, complex truths for myself, and painful histories and current affairs, and weave that all through language. I told you my background is in film, but I've had a bit of a bumpy road in film. I made one feature documentary, climate justice feature film that was also a number of festivals, but it took a lot out of me. I didn't get any funding, and I spent 4 years of my life putting everything in service of that film, and I knew that I wouldn't be able to do it again. And knowing that I work outside of the frame of mainstream, my second and my third attempt for making a film just every time couldn't get the funding right. So I had to be creative with my creative muscle, and poetry and after videos and other forms of arts just seemed to keep coming up. And it seemed to be the platform that I could get onto and be more successful in. So I just wanted to be a little bit transparent about that. So in 2013, I was part of a first poetry collective in which we really explored a little bit of I would say women of color voicing parts of our experiences, visions, and things that we didn't really see much of. And that's the picture on the left. That was the production Voice of a Woman. It was really beautiful to work with these women, and besides solo performances, we had music interventions and collective scenes that kind of brought the whole poetry in together as one show. And then besides doing spoken word on different stages, I produced my first actual show this year in March. It's for the Week Against Racism. Every year in the Netherlands, the 21st of March, there is a national march against racism and a festival, Week Against Racism, with lots of different articulations. Some of them are panels and some of them are cultural. And so here I was able to work together with some other diasporic indigenous voices from Molucca and from Philippines. I myself have Quechua ancestry, located in Bolivia, South America. And so I really love the way that poetry allows me to not have to explain anything, but be right in the middle of the emotion, be right in the middle of the analysis, be right in the middle of wherever I want to meet people through play of words. And the other picture is from Winternachten. It's a literary film. It's a literary festival in The Hague every year. And I was invited this year to bring or to write a piece specifically based on a climate futurist book by an Aboriginal author, Alexis Wright. Yeah, and so it's a climate justice, a decolonial climate justice piece. And I was going to share a poem with you. I don't know if that's your kind of thing, but I thought it would be helpful, instead of just talking about the stuff I've done, to actually share a poem and ask you to reflect on it. How, like I shared about feeling very free in my experience as a trainer or as an organizer. And as a woman of color, I tend to have to explain a lot. And explaining is not that much fun. You know, that's why art doesn't have to explain. It has to resonate. It has to communicate on an emotional level, or at least with the gut. It has to communicate with the gut. And yeah, so I was sharing a little bit about how poetry allows me to speak from a positionality without having to explain, but just being there, so I don't have to come and get you, explain why climate change is bad, or why climate change and racism are related. But just be there, and from there I can articulate. So this is a piece I'm going to read, which is spoken from the point of view, well, it's about human supremacy culture, and positioned as the point of view of a tree. And I want to ask you to listen and reflect on the way that positionality of the tree blurs lines with certain positions or experiences of human communities. Write down like 2 of the sentences you hear that remind you of a human voice. And I'll explain why that matters to me. So here it goes. Let me just read this. We are the web. We are the underground. We are underground. Here is where you find our brains. This is how we are arranged: plant, feeling, sentience, permeating, pulsing, keeping the animal kingdom alive. Do not mock us. Do not taunt us. Do not disturb the peace that lives among the trees. Do not poison what you need to breathe. Do not kill us to write your history on, history that will soon be gone. We are not a plantation. Don't depress us into isolation. Monocultures choke our intelligence. We are clever together. We support our elders, our stumps, to live on and pass on memory and share. This is how we weep, dream, and secretly share sugars with our offspring, siblings, saplings, and savvy underground alliance. Come and play with us. Come and sit under our branches, witness our friendship, watching out for one another, being each other's mother. Our memory is slow and vast, an internet that was built to last. We will never run out on you, but you may be running out of time to meet us as we hit tipping points of forest die-off, clear cuts wiping out your great carbon sink, wasting watersheds and disturbing everything, industries ravaging, depleting topsoils, invading our habitat, destruction of forest floors, forest burning, climate change, our social realities denied or ignored. Look at our green communism. It works for our longevity. Only together can we regulate microcosms and benefit collectively. Mycorrhizal fungi mediates and trades based on needs and necessity. We benefit collectively. Do not mistake our cemented brothers for loners. Underground, he is signaling SOS to the wood wide web. We love company. We are a diverse team. Together is how we minister our moisture regime. We are so related. Do not disturb our facilitation. Why do you resent a friend? Why are you afraid of a friendly nature, forever trying to antagonize through obedience to your civilization of ecocide, shredding our bodies to paper to wipe your ass with, single-use everything? Have you forgotten we are your true supermarket for any good? Are you scared to honor your source, your food? All life eats life. To support life, every meal is sacred, but it comes with a contract to service. Why are you just taking? Are you cynical to our relatedness, forever dabbling in supremacy? Are you blind to basic realities of the wood wide web? Without us, you would all be dead. We stand tall, we stand our ground while chainsaws slaughter our kin. Do you want our chopped up body pieces to feed your ideology of exploitation? Do you want our land to impose your cities for settler colonization? What about the wood wide web? What about us? Your green environment you depend on. You are counting your produce. We are counting our losses. The wood wide web is calling. We need healing from this haunting violence perpetrated to our seedlings and our flowers. We are not decoration for your perverted parties. We have a life of our own. Connecting the underground with the heavens above. We are the world in between. Back the fuck off. Or, as we say in our own language, our own chemistry, respect the wood wide web and act only if you receive our green light. Thank you. So this piece was inspired by the work of Peter Wollebe. He's, what do you call it, a wood ranger or somebody who takes care of the woods. He has written books. It's actually a way that I sometimes have worked in the past before, like reading dense books about politics of Bolivia and fighting for rights for Mother Earth, and then doodling and kneading it into an emotional experience that encompasses the vision or the analysis, but more from a lived experience. So for me, this is very much tied to my experience of Indigenous identity being erased by colonizing culture. And so, while I am not a tree, I'm combining the insights of somebody who takes care of trees, Peter Wollebe, with my own experience of fighting against extractivism and always being the sacrifice zone and always being seen as lesser than. Yeah, I'm wondering what you heard and how it landed. If poetry is your thing, or environmental spoken word is, I can suggest maybe you want to look up this other video that I made in a collaboration with Greenpeace, Greenpeace Conversation with Chihiro Geuzenbroek, on climate care. And it's situated in an imaginary museum of climate justice. It's a theme for me. And it's looking in an animated form and in a spoken word form of like, how did we get here? And how do we restore situated in this Museum of Climate Justice? And yeah, that's all I'm going to say about it. But I really love marrying poetry and animation because it opens up a world of possibility. I hope you will enjoy it. One of my favorite realms of creativity and activism is hoaxing. These are a few documentaries that the Yes Man made. They're two guys. Their fake names are Andy Bickelbaum and Mike Bonanno. So everything about them is fake. The first documentary came out in 2003, so that's a while back. And it really shows that with a handful of people, you can shake things up, you can have an impact. And you can do it with a lot of humor, where a lot of people often dread activism because you hit on a lot of pain when you're dealing with world injustices and political harm, people dying in war, people dying because of torture or rape or poisoning, or having to flee over militarized borders. A lot of the topics in activism where you stand up with people, for people, people's rights, that they can get very heavy. And hoaxing is a way to lower the threshold of engagement. Like in our culture, there's so many ways in which we're not emotionally available to even connect with others, let alone the world at large. So hoaxing is a way of lowering that barrier through often humor and parody. And what they do is they present themselves as spokespeople of big corporations, or like the World Trade Organization or Dow Chemicals. And their most famous hoax is for going online or on TV on the BBC as a spokesperson for Dow Chemicals, and presenting that they will give reparations for the Bhopal disaster, where around 3,800 people died because of the disaster, because of this corporation, and many more people, thousands of people died afterwards because of the toxic fumes. And this was a disaster that was already predicted year after year after year, but never the conditions were changed. And so when the disaster happened, it was a political disaster because it was constructed. It was so they announced on TV that they would just spend, as that company, billions in reparations to do right by the communities that were impacted. And what happened afterwards was that the shares of this huge multi-billion corporation started dropping. And so it had a huge effect. And then of course it came out that they are not real representatives of the company. But the company was then, of course, asked, why is this not happening? Or in this documentary, they also asked the question of why is it not happening? They also do ridiculous things, going into corporate conferences when they're invited to speak for a corporation and proposing really super absurd capitalist schemes that are really abusive of the employees, or really calculating for skeletons in the closet of your company and the way to mitigate human losses on your work floor, for shock value, for ridiculing a certain way of doing business. But often they find they get, oh, that's interesting. And it kind of shows how far the logic of undermining human lives, environmental degradation, is embedded in the whole corporate business as usual. And they do it with a lot of humor. So they've inspired a whole wave of activists to do things along the line of hoaxing. I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna go here. This year, early in the year, I'm part of a coalition of different groups that together make up the Shell Must Fall campaign that works to not just hold Shell accountable for dis pollution or dis human right violation, but to actually hold them accountable for, you're not part of the green transition. We actually need people who are not killing the locals in Nigeria, or who are not lying about climate change, or who are not. So that's the angle of Shell Must Fall campaign, not just to make them pay a fine, but actually saying we need to eliminate this business of mass destruction. And this was a hoax action that we did. Yeah, so as you can see, we went into The Hague, where the headquarters of Shell fossil fuel company is situated. So here it still looks like a protest because there are some banners, but what we actually did in the neighborhood, we went into the neighborhoods and spread a folder or a flyer that says, we are building a fair recovery with some construction workers, Beton BV, and this was announcing that The Hague, they realized that it's the city of peace and justice. That's how it brands itself. So, and they also have this bestemmingsplan, this destination plan, of being mostly zero carbon or climate neutral city by 2030. So that wouldn't match having Shell, in The Hague. So they would need a new destination plan for it. And so they would develop a tribunal for climate justice, as they already have the tribunal for peace. And they like to think of themselves as the city of peace and justice. But it's totally in the voice of the city. So it's not the activist voice saying like, hey, we come to this conclusion that we're going to build this beautiful thing for the neighborhood, for peace, for justice, for climate. So this is our new building. We're going to go through this demolition. And if you have any questions, we will try to limit the movements in the street so you don't have any nuisance of the construction work. However, if you do have any questions or a nuisance, please contact us. This is the contact number of Shell office. And this we spread through all of the neighborhood. So I think we had around 1,200 flyers in the streets around it. And so it was a way of not targeting, in this time, this COVID time, you can't do big actions with thousands of people. Shell Must Fall comes from more of a tradition of doing mass civil disobedience. This is hard to do in COVID times. So we experimented a little bit with more of a creative approach in which we can do something different with less people. And we directly targeted their neighborhood as an audience coming through the mailbox. So I can't really reflect on the results. I don't think they're very activist-y results, but I definitely think that we hit a different communication stream through that hoax, through that different way of approaching a vision for how it could be. Instead of saying this is wrong, that is wrong, that is wrong, we just say like, wow, we could have a tribunal for climate justice here, and it's the city of peace and justice, you know, this is, wow, we want to invest in that. So these are just a few pictures that were shared also on Instagram. We definitely got their attention, even though it was on a day with COVID, only a few people are in the building. There were one by one coming to the window to take pictures of the wrecking ball. Later, when a court case against Shell, the results came in from the judge, different media outlets started using our pictures with the wrecking ball in front of Shell in totally unrelated news about Shell in court. And it is a very powerful picture of like showing that your time is up without having to say it in words, to put it into a picture. And so we also came with these construction sites banners that you often have of like, we are building this mall, or 4,000 people can live in this building that we're building for you. But we did it about, you know, soon here will come a court to bring justice, and pictures from people in Nigeria. Actually, we also read some of the speeches from people in Nigeria that we're in contact with that are impacted communities. Yeah. This is just another kind of, it wasn't much of a hoax, but also kind of playing with identity correction. So when you present yourself as the other, here obviously being very fake, because you know, you can see those are fake faces of the CEO of Shell, Ben van Beurden, and the head of the board, Charles Holiday. You can speak in their voice, everything will be all right, and other lies, and comment on it at the same time. This was also during COVID, getting creative. Here we have the CEO and the head of the board eating from a cake that is shaped, or it has a print of the world on it. And then we have a video where they're cutting up the cake, the pieces of the world, and they're taking it and they're eating it. And so again, this is without giving a lecture on you know, what's happening in Mapuche community with Shell fracking, or what's happening in Canada in indigenous land with pipelines that Shell is involved with, or you can talk about 20 different countries and apartheid in South Africa that Shell invested in, and in Nigeria, and in Groningen, and in Philippines, and halfway through your head might be full with all of this information, but here we can talk through symbols. We have this banner in the back of a Shell logo shattered into pieces by a hammer, which is a hammer of a judge. So again, through image, you can tell a whole story in a context of climate justice. So this leads me to culture jamming. I have to go through it fast. It kind of speaks for itself. Culture jamming is using advertisement, fake advertisements, often posters, but it can be different. And you can put them up in bus cubicles, replace the posters that were there. So you're also cleaning up the advertisement space and reclaiming streets. Here, natural gas causes natural disasters. This was done by a coalition. I was just getting some pictures. So I've also worked for Greenpeace at some point in different positions. And in 2019, I was working as a coordinator between different fights against oil and gas in Brazil, in Russia, in New Zealand, in Australia, in Canada, in Nordic countries. And we organized a day of action in 26 cities. We had posters that all did fake advertisements. So it's culture jammers versus oil. So this was in Chicago next to the Trump Tower. And this was, I forget in which city in Russia. There were 3 cities, I think, in Russia that joined. There were cities in Canada and Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. Here in Amsterdam, we had the Klimaatnoodtoestand. In Greece, there were some local groups that joined. Also got some media presence in Montreal with this installation in the city. So climate change brought to you by kind of bringing it closer. So often we only hear that humanity is wrecking the earth, but there's actually a handful of companies that have done over 2/3 of the climate disruption. It's, to me, I still really like that these designs, they're really communicate like a series, and they communicate that people could use their own tone of voice. Like some people would use climate disaster more, and others more climate grief or climate emergency. So that could be really attuned to the local communication, what made sense in their country, and also which baddie. So like Equinor is very specific to Scandinavia, and OMV was very specific to New Zealand. I am not a huge musician of any sorts, but I have made songs for the movement. I've also made songs for my film. And one of the songs that has been most picked up in terms of other people singing it, other people using it in their videos, has been the Shell Must Fall song, which I'm gonna play, and which I've also just now in August am performing alongside a very huge inspiration of mine, Loki, as a rapper from the UK, Iraqi UK hip hop artist. So you can see that even if as an activist, you are not a huge musician or of any sorts, when you make a song for the movement, it can be bigger than yourself. And so also for the video clip, we made ourselves very invisible. Like you will see Florian, the person who arranged the music and co-singer, and me only once in a picture here and in a picture there, but the rest is really about the storytelling of climate justice.
Do you remember 300,000 Ogoni people on the streets in '93 to end the ecological war waged by the corporate greed? 3,000 oil spills, no reparation. Then came the military. Crops are destroyed and petrodollars, but killing the police. We block the streets, disrupt their industry. Oh, can you hear our call? Shell must fall. Oh, Shell must fall. Ogoni people not forgotten. Shell must fall. Raped and tortured and murdered for oil. Ogoni people not forgotten. Shell must fall.
When you hear all of the groups saying Shell must fall, that was done with in mind having this on stages at climate protests so people could join in and it would be collective. So these are just a few of the things of keeping that into consideration of how a song can be more about the us than about the me. Okay, finally about the us. If you're into music, and that is definitely part of your creative set, you should know about Rhythms of Resistance here in the Netherlands, a drumming group that always, well, not always, but often goes along with protests to provide a musical theme, a beat. Klimaatkoor, a choir for climate justice. It's often also at marches. And Hot Stuff, it's from XR. It's really fun. It's like a song contest for our planet. I think they've had 7 editions, each edition 7 songs or artists are getting featured. It's nice, you can watch it or you can join. So that was just a shout out. So here we are at an exhibition I had last year in collaboration with Milieu Defensie. They wanted a pop-up expo alongside work they did for the court case, something more public facing. And it ended up being a whole exhibition in Amsterdam in the NDSM. So you see here 20 different pieces in the expo. I will shortly just highlight a few of them. It was important when people entered. It was all about a century of resistance against Shell. And it was, the first installation was Earth as a crime scene, and kind of connecting the atmospheric disruption that often gets talked about in CO2 and in numbers and science, connecting that with the ground experience. And before the colonization of the atmosphere is the colonization on the land, and there's human lives and forests and racism that are part of the story. So this was different, like 40 or 50 reasons in which Shell caused harm or caused people to be in a movement against it. Here's one around involvement in apartheid in South Africa. A petty example of Shell's acceptance of apartheid was shown by the company's proud announcement that 25 luxury toilets have been installed in their service stations for whites only. Shell's public relation officer pointed out that when we find that the non-whites have proved that they are capable of looking after and keeping their present toilets clean, the new luxury restrooms would be made available to them. So it's just through a little blip of history, you get a sense of bigger struggles that were later explored in the expo as well. So we had a whole section on South Africa involvement and anti-apartheid struggle against Shell here in the Netherlands in the 80s. Part of this installation was also working very intimately with Earth, making that our starting point, which also caused that, you know, to have the infrastructure was delivered through a big truck. We made this whole paper mache world map, and we had to maintain it because throughout the time of the exhibition, the Earth dried out, so we had to water our exhibition from time to time. And this working with Earth as a crime scene was then mirrored in the installation after it. You see here bricks that came loose from the houses of Groningen from the gas quakes. So through gas extraction, many earthquakes have been accelerated. There's over 1,000 earthquakes in the north due to gas quakes. And so we see here again, like the local crime scene of Exhibit A and Exhibit B, all these broken homes and these broken lives, in a sense, through the logic of extractivism, with a question to the audience: what makes you hangry for change? The last thing I'm going to quickly mention is this installation, or this kind of banner piece. It plays with the notion of ppm, parts per million, which is often the door through which climate is discussed in the scientific realm. How much parts per million are in the atmosphere. Has to go underneath 350 again, and it's over 400. And we play with that timeline since, what is it, 1800, 1900, to the future, and taking that heartbeat of CO2. Each year there's more CO2 and less because of winter and summer, with trees kind of breathing the CO2 levels as a heartbeat. But we put that heartbeat connected to people-powered movements, a different kind of ppm, and this acceleration of people-powered movements as a root cause of a remedy, and these parts per million as a root cause of crisis, kind of playing with that. This was a hall for commemoration, so for mourning, also having emotional difference in the exhibit for losing major land defender leaders in Nigeria that were murdered, and seeing them as a seed that from their life's work, there was different quotes from Ken Saro-Wiwa, new resistance blooms or rises, and we keep them alive inside. There was interactive learning, so you could play a little ball game, practicing Shell Must Fall. There was recycling of banners and photography. The model Ariel was also there at the opening. So yeah, this is just a little introduction of how in climate justice struggle you might employ different creative muscles or creative practices to deal with emotionally complex and also breaking through frames of science that climate has often been narrowed down to, and opening that up to deal with a bigger body of harm, both in humans and communities. I hope this was interesting for you and that you have an amazing exercise later this day. I've heard that your exercise will be about situationist interventions, which I have less experience with, but I wanted to share a final note. We have been talking mostly about creative muscles and that being the starting point of your intervention. But of course, in conventional protest or manifestation, you also want to get a message out. Like there's basically, you have protest and resistance. And protest, it comes from protest, proclamation, advocating. So you're advocating for something, but the tendency is for news to only report about what you're against. So the more visual you can make your manifestation or your protest, the more they can't just frame you about being a no-sayer, but you can frame what you're fighting for visually. So in this case, I embodied here in this climate march the stark choice between the earth, on the one hand, the scale, or the capital and the corporate extractivism of Shell in the Netherlands, in the Dutch context, on the other hand. So you can capture that in a picture. Also, of course, banners. The more visual you can make it, the more it reaches the heart, or it reaches the gut, where so much emotional intelligence lives. This was a banner I was involved in for organizing a block in the anti-racism march. I'm not going to explain it, but if marches are your thing as well, and you want to use your creative skill set as an artist to contribute to it, these are some of the kind of 10 tips that I also share with people in the movement. Of course, rhyme helps memorability. Parody and humor and irony are often helpful. The gross factor, can you make it really gross? Yeah, can you feel it in your stomach? So it's not just the theoretical wrong or injustice, but it's something that comes closer to your bodily response. Can you be very specific? Can you create a vision? Can you be very visual, like the poster here of Shell in South Africa? It's very visual of what you're actually tanking, of this tanks fueled to kill Black lives. It's a poster from the 80s here in the Netherlands. Either or comparisons, like burn borders, not coal. You give an analogy. It can also help very much with banners. Speaking from a particular group identity can also help. Humanizing protest. The tendency mainstream is to put you outside of the realm of normal citizens. So the way you can humanize yourself, being part of society, it helps. So yeah, another example I had here for irony is someone needs to explain to me why wanting clean drinking water makes you an activist and why proposing to destroy water with chemical warfare doesn't make you a terrorist. That irony helps. So I want to wish you happy dwelling. Also want to share a note, an activist note, that when I think about situationist interventions, they can come with, historically, with a little bit of lack of understanding that the city is not for everyone, that there's a lot of exclusion just for entering streets. And making that comment in an artistic way, I wanted to share with you the wall of paper monument for the sans-papiers, the without papers, the undocumented. These are all people that are being remembered in public space for not having access to the cities like citizens have. Also, I wanted to reflect on this idea of wandering as a way of, or as a starting point for your intervention. This idea of swarming within Extinction Rebellion, in which you do like these interventions of blockades in the streets, but only for 7 minutes, and then you just swarm away from each other and you come back together somewhere else and do it again. Wanted to also nest that idea or seed that idea of how certain artistic practices can also be kind of have connotations with particular practices in activism. And I said that that's not really a form that I engage with much, but I do think, diving back way into my memory, like going to Occupy, I remember I was one of the organizers of the first camp, and I organized a van to take lots of stuff there. And on that day, I just happened to see in front of my house a few little couches. In Dutch, we call a couch a bank. And so I took these few couches into the van and brought them to the square where we were occupying for months. In the end, we didn't know. We were just, thinking we're going to do something for a weekend. And these banks or couches we decorated with the message "People Before Profit Bank," and we put it in front of the stock market building there. And that was kind of, in my mind, a little bit situationist, of just stumbling over things and repurposing it, and yeah. So that's really it. This is my final slide. If you like watching things, I wanted to also recommend Dispatches from Elsewhere, which is also kind of toying with situationist interventions and a little bit of activist-y themes, but in a very bizarre, playful manner. And then, of course, 2 movies that are watchable online that also play with music and activism: The Uprising from Prefini and Radical Friends, my own film, that is available on the website for free download, radicalfriends.com. So that's really it. I hope that was an hour, because that was a lot. Have a lovely day. Ciao.